number of characters to, simplify the story. And there was quite a bit of fictionalization, so, rather than getting into a whole lot of, the movie said this and this is what really happened, I'm just going to tell you how it went. But, some of the changes, the fictionalizations that they made are completely understandable. I had two brothers, Don and Dwayne, that they made into one character named Dan. And Sheriff Waters was actually a combination of several investigators, even our famous UFO skeptic that was attacking us there on Larry King. But it was me back in the day. Crew cab that we were riding in. We were doing field reduction work, which was, to within the whole contract, several hundred acres. But there were strips through there where we would cut up everything that we were thinning and pile it in the clearings so that it could be burned in the wet season. That way you'd eliminate all the fuel in these strips and make it easier to fight forest fires. So it was really kind of rather than logging, it was more what we call timber stand improvement, which is to eliminate diseased and damaged trees and try to improve the forest. But we were driving out of there this day. We put in a long, hard day, and it was starting to get dark. We just loaded up our equipment. We're driving up through there, and we saw these glimmers of light coming through the trees. And, it was something out of the ordinary to start with, but not all that alarming. But we had been called, the crew being experienced with, chainsaws cutting trees. And whenever there would be a forest fire, they would call us out to fight the fire. And so, that's what we were thinking, because it wasn't that unusual. The highest number of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States is right there in the Mogollon Rim, other than the Everglades, which is the only other high lightning strike place. But all kinds of things, we're thinking, any kind of a light in the forest, you're thinking, this is definitely out of place. But my first thought was that it could be deer hunters, because it was deer hunting season. But the light was coming from higher than where the top of the ridge would be. This road was paralleling the crest of the ridge, and the lights was from higher up. And I thought maybe it was the moon, but then we looked it over, and the moon's over here, and thinking maybe a crashed plane, all kinds of ideas popping up. But it wasn't all that alarming at first. But then I could see where there was a break in the trees up there, and I said, might get up there where we can see what it is. And as soon as we, came into that little shaft of light, boom, there it was, hovering less than 100 feet away. Our famous UFO skeptic that came up with the theory that it was the planet Jupiter, which would be a little tiny point of light way off in the sky. But, this was less than 100 feet away, clearly defined metallic object hovering there, outlined against the sky. And, Alan was in the back and he yelled out, "It's a flying saucer." There was just no mistaking it. I just had the idea that this thing was going to take off and it'd just be gone before I got very close. So I was throwing open the door even as the truck skidded to a halt. Mike didn't really know why, because I just yelled out, "Hey, Mike, stop the truck." Because he wasn't even all that concerned about where the source of this light was until Alan yelled out "flying saucer," and I said, "Stop the truck." And then he skidded to a stop, and I got out and started towards it. And Alan and Steve later said that it looked to them like I was in some kind of a trance, like I was under outside control. But it did not feel that way to me at all. I was just, curious and actually, kind of showing off a little bit for the guys in the truck, at first. But the closer I got, the scareder I got, and realizing that I'd really kind of got myself in a sort of an embarrassing, dangerous situation. And so the closer I got, the slower I got, and the more anxious they got and started really cussing me out. So they wanted me to get in the truck and just take off with them and get the heck out of there. But it was entrancing in the sense that it was so imposing. It was beautiful and frightening at the same time. Closer I got, I could just feel my heart just pounding, and some of the guys in the truck said it seemed like something was about to happen. And it wasn't just that I was getting so close. There was, I think, some kind of a charge building up, some kind of an electrical charge. When I got up pretty close to it, I was looking up at an angle, and it was just smooth as glass, the whole surface of it. Even though parts of it were metallic and parts of it were glowing, the whole surface was just perfectly smooth. John said it was beautiful and frightening at the same time. Even Mike said that, but John compared it to like a brand new Corvette or something, which is kind of an odd thing. But the sound was off the range of human hearing on the high end and the low end at the same time. You could kind of like feel it. I could feel it in my body, and those guys said that they could feel it in the truck. And when I got up and was looking up at it like that, suddenly the sound got louder. And, I was already scared, but I just sort of instinctively just jumped for cover. And there was a pile of logging debris in the middle of the clearing that was going to be burned in the wet season. But I jumped down behind the end of the log there, and those guys were really in a frenzy at that point, saying, "Get the hell out of there," So I decided to stand up and run back to the truck. And when I straightened up, that's when I felt this numbing shock go through my body. It was, I've never felt anything like that in my life, but it was kind of like an electric shock and kind of like just being hit by a truck, I'd had a couple of motorcycle wrecks before, and it was that stunning sort of a force of a physical blow and electrical at the same time. One of the crewmen, Dwayne Smith, and not to be confused with my brother Dwayne Walton, but a lot of people mix that up in the stories about this. But Dwayne Smith later became a journeyman electrician, and he said that in working around heavy industrial equipment, that when these giant switches would close, that surge of energy that he heard sounded to him like what happened when that blast of energy hit me. In one of the, in the police file, the sheriff's file, one of the deputies wrote a report saying that a crewman described it as looking like a long blue flame. Others describe it as like a lightning bolt or a blue-green laser blast. But they said the power of it was like I'd stepped on a landmine, like a grenade exploding, throwing me through the air so violently. It's really strange to me that with all the fictionalizations that Hollywood made about the incident, that they actually played that down. In the movie, it's just like this little spotlight comes on and just tosses the actor back. But it was so violent. John says that my body landed like a sack of meat, that I was limp with no defending myself when I hit the ground. Steve said it threw me like 20 feet, my body tumbling through this blast of light, so that they immediately concluded that I was dead. They said they were screaming at each other, "He's dead, he's dead, let's go." And I always try to explain that those guys were not doing anything cowardly when they took off at that point. Somebody in the truck screamed, "Get us out of here." But Mike's responsibility was the safety of the entire crew. And there was no sense in them hanging around trying to rescue somebody they thought was already dead. And so there was nothing unheroic about that at all. Mike was doing the heroic thing, actually, saving his crew. And so he blasted down through that rough road, dang near destroying the truck. They got up there a ways, and they were arguing about what to do, and they were, saying, discussing what had just happened. And Dwayne Smith said, "I think it blew him to pieces. I think he disintegrated." And Steve was saying, "No, he was still in one piece when I saw him hit the ground." They saw some deer hunters, and they tried to catch them, thinking that they would get people with guns to go back, because they were already realizing that they had to go back. When they couldn't catch the hunters, Mike pulled over and said, "Look, we got to go back. And a lot of the guys were saying, no, let's not go back. Let's just go get help first. And when Mike said, look, this truck's going back. Anybody that doesn't want to go can just get out and wait here for us, and we'll get you when we come back. In the movie, everybody got out and Mike went back alone. In real life, nobody volunteered to stand alone in the dark while the crew left them standing there. So they all went back, and I hand it to those guys. That was courageous. They were thinking they had to try to rescue me. So as they returned to the spot, Kenny said that his greatest fear was not about the craft still lurking around, because they saw it take off. And his main anxiety was how my body was going to look. He expected to find a charred corpse. And so when they got there, they found where the truck had spun out, so they knew that they were in the right spot. And they did a search there. They said they were looking and calling, and at one point Mike, just fell to his knees and broke down crying. And it was just kind of an overload for him. It was just real temporary. He got a grip on himself and, took charge again. But they went back to town. They were arguing back and forth. Let's go get some help. We got to report this. And Alan didn't want to. He'd always been in trouble with the law, and he said, no, we'll just get some friends with guns, and then if we can't find Travis, we'll report it to the police. But then, one of the others said, well, how's it going to look if Travis is never found and we don't report this right away? So they decided to go ahead and report it to the sheriff. And so they went and found a phone booth and called it in. And the sheriff and his men came out there, and some of the guys were still crying. Steve was still crying. He got so mad at me for reporting that he was still crying. He knew that he was still crying. But he was the youngest guy on the crew. He came over to my house when my book came out, and he wanted to fight because I told about him crying. But I said, Steve, it's not about how tough we were. It's about how overwhelming the experience was. You need to get over that. And in some ways, I don't think he ever did get over that. But the sheriff thought, because of the incredible impact on these men, that something terrible had happened, but that they had killed me. That there had been some kind of a fight, and probably with chainsaws, pretty gory mess, and that they had just come up with this spur-of-the-moment crazy explanation why, no more Travis. Well, the sheriff organized this massive manhunt, went on for days. They had men on horseback. They got the tracking dogs from the state prison, helicopters, airplanes, people on foot combing the area for miles around. The tracking dogs found no trail from where I left the truck up to where my body fell in the clearing. So during this whole time, the accusations of murder were increasing all the time. And there was some pretty testy confrontations between the searchers and the crew. And they volunteered. They said, we'll take lie detector tests, sodium pentothal, anything you want. We're telling the truth. And so the sheriff brought in the state police lie detector expert, Cy Gilson. You saw him in the film. A top expert in the state, and probably one of the best in the United States, because, polygraph men that do police work, law enforcement work, are considered the top of the game. And so when the men passed, then it just became this big, long attempt to explain it away some other way. It was just a whole onslaught of the most ridiculous accusations. They come up with the idea that I'd had a transitory psychosis, had temporarily become insane. They come up with another theory that the hypnotist had planted these memories in my mind. They come up with the idea that it was all a drug hallucination. But I had blood and urine samples put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, which proved there was no trace of any drug of any kind in my body. The hypnotism was witnessed by 3 or 4 psychiatrists, and it was all tape recorded and everything, and there were no leading questions of any kind. Everything that was described under hypnosis came out spontaneously with no prompting or leading questions. And I had a whole battery of psychiatric tests which proved it to be normal, totally normal. But, you know, it was absurd that anybody would latch on to those kinds of explanations. It seemed like the flimsiest way to explain it away. People would just latch onto it and say, yeah, that's why it never happened, you know. But if it was a delusion for me, how do you explain the 6 other men seeing the same thing? 6 men are not going to have 7 men are not going to have identical hallucinations, whether it be drugs or psychosis, and they didn't undergo hypnosis. So, you know, how do you explain them experiencing the same thing? So it was a long, hard battle fighting back against this kind of stuff. But what came out under hypnosis was very traumatic, you know. And before the hypnosis, I couldn't get it out. I couldn't finish a sentence. Not even my brother, who had kind of kept me away from the mirage, you know, mob of media and people, you know, trying to get at me. But the hypnotist's skill was to remove the emotion, at least to a degree high enough that I was able to, you know, tell what happened for the first time under hypnosis. I woke up, I was laying on the table, I was in a lot of pain, just pain. I didn't even know where I was, didn't remember even the UFO thing at first. And I was in and out of consciousness for a long period of time. But I knew something was terribly wrong inside. I felt like I was dying. I felt like I was suffocating. And there's a scene in the movie where the actor's held down on the table, these 3 beings are standing around him, and they've got a membrane over his face. And that didn't actually happen. But I think that's one place where they fictionalized that actually did a better job of communicating the reason for this out-of-control fear that I was experiencing. You know, I compare it to waterboarding. You know, even though the terrorists train for it, our own people train for it, still works, because that feeling generates fear that you just can't reason away. So combining the feeling of something mortally wrong with me, the feeling of suffocation more than anything, the dim lighting, the claustrophobic, it was a very cramped, small space in there. All that just combined to make, when I finally could focus my eyes, see, I thought I was in a hospital. I remembered approaching the object, and I thought maybe running away, I'd fallen and gotten hurt or something, and the crew had taken me to the hospital. But these were not doctors moving around me. When I could finally focus clearly, because it was just a blurry mess, then that's when I saw these beings standing there. And that extra fear gave me the strength to, you know, try to get away from them. I tried to move my arm and hit them. It was more of a push than anything, because I could hardly move. And I made contact with one of them, and he fell back into the other one, he or she, whatever it. It was softer and lighter than I expected. But this thing they had over my chest fell off when I rolled away in the opposite direction. And they came around the table immediately, and I was just keeping my attention just riveted on them. That was the biggest threat to me. And I was so wobbly and so weak that I sort of staggered back, and I bumped up against this shelf or workbench behind me, and I just looked to see what I had bumped into. And there was a bunch of instruments laid out there, some kind of shiny metallic things, and a black thing, and a couple of black things. And there was this long clear tube that's, you know, kind of cropped off in this picture, but I'm holding this long plastic or glass rod as a weapon. I even tried to break the tip off it, you know, to make it more threatening. And I started swinging it at them and screaming not to come any closer. And they stopped. But at that point, where the 3 of them were standing right there and staring into me, that was the focus of my nightmares for so long after that. Because that stare seemed to be invasive. It seemed to be, you know, like they were looking into me. And it has a squirmy sort of a feeling in my head that was painful. And I think I figured out what was going on there. I was interviewed for the movie 701. It's not out yet, but the school kids from Zimbabwe had been at recess, about 60 of them. And all the faculty were in a meeting, so all these kids are on the playground in the middle of the day. This craft comes down, and these beings, just like what you see here, got out, and they stared at them, and they communicated to them. But they said the message was friendly and pleasant, and they didn't, I asked them, because they were filming the same day I filmed, what that felt like, and they said it wasn't painful for them. So I think what they were trying to do was combine the strength of the three of them to see if they could regain control of me. Now, I'm not saying that I had some magical resistance to their ability to keep me subdued. I think what happened was when I stood up and that blast of energy hit me, that it really disrupted the neural circuits in a way where their normal method of controlling people wasn't going to work. And by combining forces, it still wasn't working. And at that point, I was a threat to them. You know, as weak as I was, they knew better than to do anything more than just take off. So they went out this door. It was the only door into this room, and they went to the right. So me, in this blind panic, this hysterical, out of control fear, I just went in the other direction. And I only figured out later what the layout of the craft was. But when I came to this round room, I was looking at these doorways on the opposite side, thinking I could just open one of them, drop to the ground, I'd be back in the woods. But that was really kind of absurd, because it probably wasn't anywhere near the woods. And these doorways were obviously way close to the interior of the craft and wouldn't have led to the outside anyway. But I went into that room and saw this really strange effect, that the farther I got into the room, more it darkened, and these points of light became visible. And but it was only to the center of the room. When I investigated the doorways to see if I could open them, I couldn't find any buttons or doorknobs or anything. So I went to this chair here, pictured in the middle of the room, to see if the buttons there would open the door. None of them would. Most of them didn't seem to do anything. But there was some that made this little screen move, and it was really just a glowing green surface with black lines without any recognizable numbers or letters. Now, some people think that maybe there was something there that was in infrared or ultraviolet that maybe I just couldn't see, and we didn't have touchscreen in those years, so I never even thought to touch the screen to see what that would do. Mainly, I just wanted to open a door. When I moved that lever on the left, it caused all these points of light to move simultaneously around me, and it was a very dizzying sort of effect. So I decided I better not mess with that anymore, because that was rather alarming. And I was really already having trouble with balance. I felt really weak. And whether that was because the atmosphere in there wasn't right for humans, or because of some injury to my chest when that energy hit me, or perhaps even that gravity was heavier in there. But I felt really weak. So when something caught my attention from the door that I'd come through, I took this guy to be a human. I thought he was from some Earth-based agency, Air Force, NASA or something, you know, there to rescue me from these monsters. You know, that was my impression at the time. And so when I ran up to him screaming all these questions, I was really just out of my mind. You know, I was totally, you know, irrational. But he just took me by the arm and was trying to lead me, and so I was thinking this was a rescue, so I went with him. And as the diagram shows, we went around, on down that curved passage, and out through what I take is probably an airlock, because it was just this little elevator-like thing. I guess it could have moved up or down, but when the other side opened, there was a ramp there leading out into this big space. Now, I don't know if the craft was there the whole time I was in the standoff with these creatures, or if it was moved into there in the meantime, but it was inside of this huge room. like a hangar, an airplane hangar, like if it was a building. If it was part of a larger craft, then it was only part of it, but it was shaped like a quarter of a cylinder laying on its side. And he seemed to be in a hurry. I tried to look around, and I could see 2 or 3 of these other disc-shaped craft, but they were more rounded and more reflective than the one we came out of, which was not glowing. It was totally metallic at that point. And these lighted panels were either some kind of a fixture that made light a lot like sunlight, or it was just translucent, and that was sunlight shining on a translucent window. But he seemed to be in a hurry, and I felt something really wrong inside. So he took me down a hallway to a room and put me in a chair, and then there were 3 other people in there like him, but without the helmet. So I took that as a clue that maybe the reason he wasn't answering and responding to any of my questions was not just that I was a raving maniac, but that maybe the helmet kept him from speaking with it on or hearing me clearly. So I started over with these other beings, and they started to try to get me to lay down on this table, you know, and I'd had enough of laying down on tables, kind of a thing, you know. I started to have misgivings about whether this was a rescue or not. And so I tried to resist. And I was in a pretty weakened condition. I mean, in those days I was very fit, but I felt pretty weak, and they felt very strong to me. They really didn't have that much trouble getting me onto that table. But in my panic, I was able to jerk one hand free and get just the edge of it under the mask that they put on my face. But it was too late. I just blacked out. Didn't hurt, everything went black. And my next memory was lying face down. My head was on my shoulder, on my arm, and it was cold. The surface was cold on my hand, but my clothes still felt warm. And there was a light above me, and I looked to see where the light was coming from, but it went off before I could, you know, direct my eyes in that direction. But there was the bottom of this craft hovering silently, totally silent, above the roadway, very shiny. I could see the surroundings reflected in it. And then it just shot straight up. I mean, it didn't turn on edge. It just stayed like that. And you'd think anything that moved that fast would just break the sound barrier or something. But it just kind of stirred the air right there and on the limbs of the tree it went past. But in spite of the fact that this was in the woods at night, there was this feeling of relief. My most recent memories were of the fear, of a panic, a feeling of claustrophobia, being trapped, of being in mortal danger. And then suddenly I'm looking at the woods and familiar, and I look down the hill with those lights, and I recognize that as being Heber. Down there's where this happened. So I ran down into the town and found a phone booth, and went into the first one, the one on the right there, and it was out of order. Last of my strength. I tried, you know, pounding on a building that had lights on and nobody came. But so this was my last hope. And so I went into the middle one, and it worked. In our part of the country at that time, you didn't have to have a coin to talk to the operator, just pick it up and dial O. And I made a collect call to my brother-in-law, Grant. Coincidentally, at that time, at that exact moment, was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And years later, I did a radio interview, and this disc jockey from the Great Lakes area was telling me about this. He was saying during the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald that they had a number of UFO sightings. They'd actually scrambled jets to go investigate. And 29 people went down on that boat, and every one of them disappeared. They never found a single body, which was really strange, because when the boat tipped on end, the point of it would touch the bottom, and the rest of the boat would still be above water. And so it wasn't that deep at that spot. but everybody disappeared. And one of the crewmen's name was Grant Walton. While I'm talking to my brother-in-law Grant on the phone, and he thought that this was another prank call. They'd been having a bunch of them, and he started to hang up on me. And he's just real sarcastic, like, I think you got the wrong number. You know, like he didn't believe it was me. And I screamed, no, it's me. I convinced him it was me. And he said, okay, I'll get your brother and come and get you. I said, brother, you know, my brother lived in Phoenix. That's 180 miles away. But I hung up, and I must have just passed out or something, because I was, next thing I know, I'm waking up in the bottom of the phone booth, and my brother's opening the door, and these headlights are shining in there, and he picked me up out of there and put me in the truck. And I was trying to tell him what happened. Like I said, I couldn't finish a sentence. I just, you know, was sobbing and breaking down. That fear that I had been through was the most recent memory. And but he said something about how worried my mother had been during the previous days. I said, days? He said, Travis, you've been gone 5 days. And he saw the shock on my face. He said, Travis, feel your face. And I had a 5-day growth of beard. I looked at my watch, the date had changed. For some reason, that was just like the last straw. I just kind of went catatonic there. And my brother put his arm around me, and I was just sobbing. I was just a wreck, just a total wreck. And he said, that mob is not going to get a hold of this guy. You know, unbeknownst to me, you know, this had been worldwide news before I was ever returned. There was film crews from England and Japan, people walking through the flower beds in my mother's house, taking pictures through the window. Steve said that they came to his house and was taking pictures through his bedroom window. Just crazy stuff, you know, and all these prank calls and crank calls coming in. But there was some that seemed to be well-meaning. There was this one lady said she was a nurse, and that she had been on duty when this elderly couple came in after having an UFO experience. And when she came back on shift, they were gone. Records were gone, and everybody was saying, this never happened. So she was saying, just be careful who gets a hold of him. And this other guy called and said he was retired CIA. He sounded very sane and left his contact information and said, just be careful who gets a hold of him. So my brother was really leery about, you know, and telling the sheriff, you know, what if the sheriff just handed me over to somebody? And his main concern right there was get medical help, getting checked out, you know. And that was impossible up in that area because it was just such a madhouse. So without even reporting it to the sheriff, he just took me to his home in Phoenix, 180 miles away. However, when I made that phone call from the phone booth, the operator listened in against the law, but I'm glad she did because she reported to the sheriff, and getting somebody out of bed in the middle of the night, they weren't able to get there before my brother got there. But they, you know, tested the phone for prints, and it became handy because the UFO skeptic was claiming I was someplace else, but that was proof that, you know, I was where I said I was. So took me to Phoenix. Long story about trying to get some medical help. There would have been some UFO investigators on site, said get in touch with us. Went there, and the guy said, well, I'll send you to this medical doctor, friend of his, and it turned out the guy was just a total quack. He was not a real medical doctor at all. He was just calling himself a doctor. So, but we were finally contacted by the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And this is a picture of my brother at my wedding. And, you know, he really did save my life because I was in no shape to handle the kind of interrogation that would have happened to me if he'd have just turned me over. And he was shielding me from the news media. They were just calling and knocking on the door. And so when they called his place, he told them, well, we took him to a hospital in Tucson, you know, just to get him off the trail. And so the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, they figured out that, no, I was probably with my brother. And so they said, well, look, we've got real doctors in our Phoenix membership. You know, he needs medical help. We'll, you know, work with us and we'll get him checked out. And the doctors actually came to my brother's house, did a house call. You know, it's not that nowadays. And And then I went into for further testing, blood tests, the drug tests, the EEG. They did a brainwave scan, and this backs up my theory that the hypnosis that the aliens used to control people weren't working on me because of some kind of neurological changes on account of that energy. And the EEG showed that there was an anomalous pattern. And it was especially valuable because of the media scrutiny was so high that I was put in there under an assumed name. And the technician was just told to look for signs of injury. And this was at world-famous Barrows Neurological Institute, world-famous brain trauma center. And so when we left Barrows, we were spotted in the parking lot. There he is! And they chased us through traffic. It was that crazy. And so this is L.J. Lorenzen. He was the head of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, predating even MUFON at the time by some years, and oldest and largest organization at the time. And there was Dr. James Harder, University of California at Berkeley, who performed the hypnosis on me. And Arleo Sprinkle, head of counseling and testing at University of Wyoming at the time, he reviewed all the psychiatric tests that were performed independently by others. And Dr. Jalen Hynek, he was the man behind, hired by the Air Force for Project Blue Book. And I was telling you about 701, the movie. That's a reference to Project Blue Book, the 701 cases that were unresolved after Blue Book. But Dr. Hynek issued a statement after meeting with me that, I'd been the victim of unfounded accusations and I was not hoaxing. But that night, those nightmares, night after night after night, was just about that stare, that excruciating stare. And aside from the impact, the aftermath of it was almost, the memory was almost overshadowed by all these crazy theories, all these attacks. I was hiding from the media. They're saying he's a publicity seeker, but I'm saying I don't want any interviews for weeks. And so that didn't kill the story when I wouldn't agree to an interview. It just made it more negative. So I was forced to come out of seclusion and to rebut some of these crazy theories that were going around. And it was one thing after another. This is kind of an aside, I can just tell you about it. I got this topographical map that divided the state into 70-some areas, and just coincidentally, the area where the incident happened was numbered Area 51. So either some kind of sense of humor on the map paper, quite a remarkable coincidence, but there was a lot of coincidences associated with this. But this wasn't a coincidence. When we went back to do some interviews 15 years later for the soon-to-be released movie, we had trouble locating the spot. And I didn't know why. I thought it was because of all the snow. Paramount was so determined to get there, they rented these big snow cats with 4-foot wide treads to go through the snow drifts, 3 feet deep, and got us to have an interview on the site. But so the difficulty locating the exact spot wasn't because of the snow, it was because the trees had changed. Found out later that Mike noticed that and went back the following spring and discovered that, like this tree was nearest where the craft had come down. And it was 6 inches in diameter at the time of the incident. And it was 85 years old. And in only 15 years, it doubled in diameter. And since the outside of the tree contains much more volume than the inside, it was calculated that these trees were producing wood fiber at 36 times the rate that they had for the previous 85 years. And we went back to the site to film for National Geographic, and we found a stump of a tree that had been logged the year immediately preceding the incident. So that tree had never been exposed to any effect from the UFO, but it was kind of a benchmark of the growth conditions on that ridgetop going back 200 years. And the growth rings resembled what you see there to the left here. Very little variation, some weather changes over time, but nothing like this huge leap in thickened growth afterwards. And Ben Hansen came to do supervise some follow-up research on the site, and we discovered something very interesting. The reason this core sample here gave us the impression that this effect was around the entire circumference of the tree is because we were trying to keep from killing the trees. Just take a core sample, plug it up, seal it real good, and the tree can still live. Well, the rodeo chest sky fire had come through there and killed a lot of these trees, so we were able to slice them off and see a complete cross-section and found a very interesting effect. These thickened rings were only in the direction that the craft, towards the craft. On one side of the craft, it pointed that direction. On the other side of the craft, it pointed that way. North, south, east, west. So this was a directional effect, as if there was some kind of source of energy that was causing this directly on the tree, which again undercuts any theory that there was something affecting the trees in general, like, north wind or sunshine coming from the south or anything like that, because it was strictly had to do with the direction that the craft had come down. Something else that Ben Hansen discovered was a research paper that had been done on the Scots pine trees in the vicinity of the Chernobyl nuclear accident. And those trees were found to have been producing wood fiber at 3 times the rate that they had normally. And there was also some analysis of what actually happens at the cellular level to cause this. You see, during the search, there was a man out there checking for radiation. And when Mike went up to question about what he was doing, to test us, he was acting real reluctant to have anything to do with these guys. But I tested them in and said, see, still background radiation. Mike says, well, we showered and changed our clothes. So, we went back to the truck and got the hard hats they'd been wearing the night of the incident and tested them. And they went all the way up to 6. Background radiation was 1.5. Radium dial watch was double that. And the hard hats were giving off radiation at 6 on this machine. But the guy just was real uncooperative and secretive, and he just wrapped up his machine and got the heck away from those guys. And Mike thought he knew all of the Forest Service guys, and even though this guy was wearing a Forest Service uniform, Mike had never seen him before. So we got follow-up research on these trees, follow-up on the tree nearest where the craft that brought me back was. Follow-up research with the EEG. I'm going to have another EEG done to see if that anomalous pattern is still there, and also take the original charts and to a neuroscientist and see if that correlates with someone who's experienced an electrocution or lightning strike. And so a lot of follow-up research there. This is an analysis of the wood fiber accelerated growth. And then some discoveries with the Freedom of Information Act. After our famous UFO skeptic passed away, his FBI file was gotten through the Freedom of Information Act. You can file for these papers. And you can see that large amounts of material have been blacked out. They were using too much ink blacking them out, so now they're white squares. But so much for freedom of information when they're blacking out most of it. And this is declassified, no longer secret. They were investigating the UFO skeptic class for having revealed classified information in connection with his job at an aerospace magazine. Well, curiously, this is a memo saying that they are maintaining this case in RUC status. In other words, they're not going to prosecute him. But there's a memo in here from J. Edgar Hoover to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. See, back in those days, those agencies, pre-9/11, were famous for not cooperating with each other, but for some reason the director of the Central Intelligence Agency is getting a memo from the head of the FBI concerning their investigation of this guy. And this is standard CIA recruiting tactic. You get something you can prosecute somebody for, you withhold prosecution to gain their cooperation. I don't think that they got I don't think they turned him into a UFO skeptic, but I do think they were able to direct and fund his activities. And one of those activities was to come to Steve Pierce by way of Deputy Sheriff Jim Click there in Taylor, and offer Steve a $10,000 bribe. The message was carried by a deputy sheriff to discredit the incident. Now Steve was desperate for funds and he was thinking about taking the money. So Mike said, well, if you would take that money, even though you know it really happened and would do it just for the money, then you'll be bruised. Well, Philip Klass put that in his book, but he took out the middle part of the sentence. If you take that money, you'll be bruised. And he says, from this sentence, you can see that Mike is threatening Steve to keep him from recanting, but he's altered the quotation, even though you know it really happened and would do it just for the money. So that was the kind of tactics this guy would use. He would misquote things and alter quotations in order to make people appear to say something that they didn't. And there was all kinds of, really devious propaganda techniques. Some people say, oh, forget about that guy, don't talk about that. But I think it's important for people to realize that there is an active program on the part of at least our government to discredit this subject and using, standard propaganda techniques. Right before the Larry King show, this guy calls up and said, I was there and I was a witness and I wanted to come forward, but, because the men were accused of murder. He said, but my commanding officer told me not to. I was deer hunting. I was on that far ridge and I saw the glow of the craft. I saw the flash of the beam, and I can verify that. And he said, I went to my commanding officer and said, should I come forward? And I said, no, just stay out of it unless the men are actually indicted. So he said he'd always regretted that. So I told Tracy Torme, the screenwriter on the movie, about this guy, and they flew him out to Hollywood and interviewed him, but they decided to give him polygraph tests. One test proved that he was there, and I thought he was because, he was describing the surrounding terrain. He had never been in any story. Nobody would need to describe it in that kind of detail. He'd been there, and he was telling the truth about having been there, about seeing the glow of the craft, the flash of the beam, and telling the truth about being in military intelligence. But the part of the test where he was asked about connections to Phil Klass and his group, he flunked. And so, to me, that suggested that they were trying to insinuate this guy in there, that somehow that they were either in cahoots with these aliens or at least monitoring their activities in the area. We're going to try to use that as a foot in the door to discredit it, maybe even on the Larry King show. But it backfired because the guy flunked his test. So I found out from a guy that was in one of these patriot military type militia groups, he said that he described this guy. He came up to me and said, this guy, he said he was, and he described the guy that had come to me, and he was infiltrating our group. So he was still active in working for the government, infiltrating things. And so, that was all just more evidence that this guy was working. These are quotations from the FBI file. He was not popular with them. He's well known to us. He is deficient on all points of his argument, particularly concerning the credentials of Dr. Hynek, which could scarcely be better. On the other hand, Klass has no such sterling reputation and has twice been under FBI investigation in connection with the unauthorized publication of classified information. His previous communications generally have been accusatory or argumentative in nature. And Newark, and this is a Newark FBI office, is in possession of a letter Klass mailed to Bell Laboratories suggests that reading the letter indicates writer is most likely not in full possession of his faculties. So they didn't think too much of it. And another FBI file, in view of Klass's intemperate criticisms and often irrational statements he made to support them, it was recommended that the Bureau be most circumspect in any future contacts with him. And the paragraph right below that is kind of curious. It discloses that Klass has from time to time come to our attention by virtue of the fact that he has been in, and then they redacted 9 lines that they're hiding from the public for some reason. And not to be of assistance to his government. To be of assistance to his government means working for them to, in my view, be a disinformation specialist. So the bottom 2 lines have to do with not prosecuting because to talk about these things in court would be to reveal the information that he was accused of revealing. But they prosecute people for that all the time, and all they do is, swear everybody in and seal the records. And I mean, if that were the problem, if that were why they don't prosecute somebody, nobody could be prosecuted because you have to try them. You have to say what they were doing, revealing classified information. So, some people think I give that guy way too much attention, but it's just to illustrate the kind of onslaught of attacks that went on. He called all the bars in town trying to dig up bad stories on me. They said he never comes in here, but he leaves that out of his report. Lots of research about Ken Peterson, one crewman. Nothing everybody had to say was nothing but good about him, even from the law enforcement people who had been friends with Ken's dad. And he dug and dug to find somebody that would say something bad against my mother, in spite of the fact that she had been twice nominated Woman of the Year in the town and once voted Woman of the Year for her community service. Didn't mention that at all, only something negative. So it was all about character assassination, and it was really, took a lot to have to stand up and tell what really happened. At the time that the crew passed the state police lie detector experts, the president of the American Polygraph Association said, polygraph is in the upper 90 percentile of accuracy on a single test. He said, but when you have 6 people passing tests on the same issue, the odds are over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of a mistake. And that was with 6 tests. Now there's been 16 or 17 past tests. So what the odds would be at this point is beyond my calculations, but I've passed 5 different tests with 3 different examiners, all of whom had many years of law enforcement experience. There's all kinds of corroborating evidence. Every theory the skeptics came up with was just full of holes. And a lot of ongoing research here, but I want to move on to some questions because I know you got plenty and there's just no way to get everything in here. So what, you have a question?
Thank you. When you were on board the ship for 5 days, do you have a sense that you might have been under intensive care?
Yeah, and that's very important to get in here. My more recent understanding of this was not what I thought at first, that I was captured by these horrible monsters and rescued by these human-looking people, but I really don't think we're humans. At the time, my first impression was representatives of some Earth-based agency. Now I think that there are beings out there that look a lot like us, and probably a number of species that look a lot like us that aren't even related to each other. Same thing with the so-called grays. I believe that there's a lot of very similar looking species from entirely different planets that may not even be related to each other, but just happen to look alike. But my understanding now is that I was taken aboard because I was mortally wounded, probably even killed. At least cardiac arrest, maybe something much worse. And these small creatures did the best they could. And the repairs were not completely successful. I was still in seriously injured. So I think these human-looking beings having more similar form and probably better equipment were the ones that finished the job of reviving me and putting me back in shape. And so rather than it being an abduction, I now think of it more as an ambulance call, you know, that because of an accident caused by me getting too close and this energy discharge passing through me, that I was accidentally hurt, my own fault, and that they had to fix me. Otherwise, I'm galactic roadkill. You had a follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry about that. Did you have x-rays and have you had scans since, like cerebral scanning?
What was the question?
Have you had x-rays? Have there been any evidence of fractures or did you
I had some
have
very
scans?
thorough medical tests, upper body x-rays and stuff, and everything was great. You had a question?
Yeah. Hi, Travis. Have you had further experiences since then?
I used to say, if I did, I wouldn't tell anybody, but I'll tell you about one. February 4 last, we left a MUFON meeting. Jan Harzen was there, Tracy Torme, the screenwriter, he spoke. And after we left there, we were headed up the 5 in Los Angeles towards the 10, headed home. And these 3 lights came at us, and we all of a sudden realized there was a gigantic black triangle over the top of us. And it kind of tipped sort of up on edge right as it got to us. I mean, this thing was like a city block at least, maybe an eighth of a mile across. It was gigantic. And I just wondered why there weren't people running off the freeway and stuff like that, you know. It stopped and sort of turned on all 3 of these lights. You could see the lights on the corner. To me, they look more like a propulsion unit. You know how when you look at the burner on a gas stove, how the points of light in blue are brighter, but it's all kind of a shimmering blue circle. Well, they weren't blue, they were a pale orange, but it kind of had that sort of a shimmering look to it, like there was some kind of energy coming out of it. But when they all turned, they were absolutely locked with each other. My son was driving, my girlfriend was in the back seat, and she said when it passed over, she looked out the window and it turned and went back west towards the ocean. And so I thought, you know, why isn't this all over the news, you know? But people don't look up. When we got home, we told my oldest son about it, and he went online and he found this rather obscure website called UFOstalker.com. And it's set up kind of like Google, where there's a map and you can report. And he found that at that time and place, there was another dozen reports that soon afterwards of people that saw what we saw, right there clustered together. So a few other people did see it too. Probably a lot more. It's just that most of them didn't report it to anybody, and the few that went to this site was probably just a fraction of those that we were reporting it elsewhere. So that was a very dramatic sighting for my son, who hadn't seen anything quite that positive before. You had a question?
So obviously you have not had that experience, your life would have been different. Now that you've experienced it, do you find that you have a certain purpose in life now? Or
Well, you know, there have been a number of times where I would just quit talking about it for years at a time, and I just couldn't. I just wanted to get on and have a normal life. But sometimes somebody would come out and make some outrageous claim, and I'd just get out there to see how easy it was to shoot him down. This one kid was saying he was the sheriff's nephew and that he had the inside story, blah, blah, blah. And everything he said, by then, most of the people on the internet were sophisticated enough, they were jumping down his throat because his facts didn't match up with simple known facts. He was claiming that the crew met with the sheriff at the Red Robin Diner. Well, the Red Robin Diner didn't exist for another 20 years, but that's just one example out of many where it just didn't jive. But, you know, there was another lady who said that I had just confessed that the UFO had hit me and that I just hid out and made up the rest of it. Well, I said, okay, here's $1,000 if you can bring this tape recorder you claim you made, and it's verified as being me. Here's $1,000. She got furious and just, you know, her 15 minutes of fame on the internet was just, she withdrew and hid out, and that was the end of that. But there's a lot of people that, you know, will claim that, you know, they used to hang out with me in high school and stuff like that. You know, people like, who's that? You know, anyway.
from what you've said in the docos I've seen you on, it sounds like something sometimes you've said you probably wish you'd never got out of the truck because it was quite
Absolutely.
horrific. But I get the impression there's a lot of people in this room that would love to have the contact,
Yeah, a lot
but
of
maybe
people think that.
not actually realise that it could be very, very hurtful or very, could really stuff you up.
I've said I wouldn't wish it off on anybody
Yeah,
except
that's what
maybe
I
a
was
UFO skeptic.
Well, what I want to ask is, what would be your recommendation of people who are kind of always really wanting this experience? And secondly,
Well,
how much do you think?
be careful what you wish for, But even amongst our crew, I found out here just a couple years ago that Kenny, one of the guys on the crew, actually has gone back there, camped out on the site on the anniversary. I said, Kenny, you do not want this to happen to you. But apparently he feels differently, He feels like he missed out on something. But I don't know.
I'm doing a case on radiation and plant proteins, and I'm working with an Australian university on it. And it's new technology, it's new information, nobody's ever done it before. And there's been word that in America it has just been commenced under your influence, under your case influence. Have you heard that?
No, but that would be very interesting to correlate that, because most of us would think, well, radiation, that kills things, so the plant would have probably withered and died. But these plants took off. They're compensate for the radiation by growing thicker or stronger, or to make up for weakened structure, they just make more of it or whatever. Way in the back there.
Hey, Travis, I just would like you to tell people about this coming November.
Oh yeah. If you want to come to the United States, I wouldn't mention that because I thought that might be unlikely, but next November, 5th, 6th, and 7th, I'm having the 40th anniversary conference in Hebert, the town nearest where it happened. We're going to do a visit to the site. I'll go with you, reluctantly. And we'll have a skywatch that Ben will be conducting, and a number of very interesting speakers. David Childress on the Ancient Alien Connection. The Cowboys and Aliens Connection will be Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres. There was quite a bit of activity in pre-industrial, in the Wild West days of the Southwest that shows that this phenomena is not something that just popped up after our nuclear tests or after Roswell or the Kenneth Arnold sighting, that this goes way back, that historically, like the David Childress connection, we've got petroglyphs that are pre-European showing what appears to be alien beings and craft. And you can date these rock carvings by the patina that forms after centuries. You can kind of generally date them.
Travis, just ask you a question. Are you familiar with a book called Alien Interview written by Stephen Morris, based on the interviews of Matilda O'Donnell McElroy, who was the nurse that cared for the only surviving extraterrestrial from the Roswell incident? And if you have read that book, what are your opinions and views on that?
I haven't read that book, and I really, usually just try to avoid commenting on other cases, because I do say this, there are some good cases out there, good solid evidence, some of them, well documented, and I think that has to be the standard for bringing things public, because, what we're trying to do is establish, counter the propaganda campaign that this is all kooky. It's becoming such that the kooks are the people who think we're alone in the universe. Because, the definition of a kook is somebody who has beliefs that are contrary to what's known and what's common sense. And now that, more than half the people have had sightings and believe that this is real, and in light of the Hubble telescope identifying and quantifying actually the planets that are possibly life-supporting, it really undercuts the skeptics' theory that yeah, there might be life way out there somewhere, but they can never find us. I mean, with our relatively primitive technology, if we have a telescope where we can point it in that direction and say that's a life-supporting planet, certainly civilizations 100 million years ahead of us, looking back the other way, saw us here a long time ago. So they're the kooks. We're not the kooks.
Just one question. A lot of abductees end up with scoop marks or scars on their body or spots. Did you end up with any marks?
The examining physician described what he called a 2-millimeter red spot on my inside of my right elbow, which fueled the drug hallucination theory. But you know, the medical test disproved that. But even in spite of the fact that the doctor said it was not over any major blood vessel, which of course an intravenous injection would have been. So my own theory is that that spot was just an injury that I had at work. You know, we work in a lot of brush, and some of them had thorns, and when a chainsaw hits a woody stalk, it'll just whip it back at you, and you can get poked that way. But no scoop marks. And though the upper body x-rays did not reveal any implants either.
Travis, the images of the extraterrestrials, are they accurate?
Yeah, I worked with the artist, who was Mike. He's never done anything before that or since then, but he did 20 different versions before settling in on the one. I think these ones like you're showing there, where they have this black covering, I think that's to protect their eyes. I think that's some sort of like sunglasses appliance that, because the creatures that I saw had eyes that blinked with a pupil and an iris, but it was very dimly lit in there. And you know that any animal that we have on the earth that has extremely large eyes is either nocturnal, in the deep ocean, or lives in a cave, you know, very low light conditions. And so this, just the light in this room would probably be unbearable to them, so they wear these coverings. But there's, again, you know, we assume that they have to be all the same. I'm saying that similar environments create similar forms. Here in Australia, you have something called a sugar glider. In America, there's something called a flying squirrel. They look very similar. They're nocturnal, they live in the woods, and sugar gliders are not squirrels. I mean, marsupials diverged from the main mammalian line millions of years ago, but because of similar environments, you have similar forms. Every animal in the sea, whether it be mammal, bird, fish, amphibian, reptile, they all take on a very fish-like appearance. And there's a number of examples where you have animals that look quite a bit alike here on the earth, but they're not genetically related at all. So my theory is that there's lots of what we call grays that are from completely different places. Same thing with the human-looking ones. But it does kind of explain why they might have a particular interest in us. You know, just on the basis of our similarity, they're kind of curious about us more than anything. But that brings me to the point about the alien agenda. People talk about what they're up to, as if they're just one entity with one purpose. I think there's probably as many agendas as there are species visiting us. So, next question.
I'm here.
Okay.
Did you believe in aliens before this all happened?
Yeah, I did. But it wasn't any big fixation. Of course, the skeptics tried to make it out that I was obsessed with the idea, but I never joined any UFO organizations or bought any books on the subject or subscribed to any periodicals, never went to a UFO conference. But the subject came up a few months before the incident because there had been some cattle mutilations in Apache County. And so, you know, we were talking about something that was in the paper. And so, you know, it's just one topic out of many topics.
I want to thank you on behalf, I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone in the room here today, on behalf of all of us here for travelling to Australia, for your courage, your conviction and your humility throughout the years. It's been an extraordinary case. And I'd just like to know, for my personal satisfaction, what happened at the end of that Larry interview, because it looked like to me that Phil Plass completely unraveled on air, especially when Mike Rogers said to him, well, I want to have a look at your tax records, Bill. I think you're working for a government.
Yeah, there was quite a bit said there that was very enlightening. They did not have class in the same room with us. He was piped in on a monitor in another part of the studio. I don't know, he might have not even been, but he does live in Washington, D.C., and that's where the show is based from. But he never addressed me directly. I never addressed him directly. He addressed Mike by breaking into profanity. Mike, you're a GD liar, right on national television, which just made him look bad, you know, because
he had that extraordinary moment where he actually said, well, what am I supposed to do? What are any of us supposed to do if this is a reality? How do we deal with it? And I think in a way he was unraveling.
Yeah, and you know, the really curious thing about him is that's the closest he ever got to me. He come to Steve. He actually flew to Texas, found Steve, even though Steve had changed his name to Jeff, and took him out to dinner and tried to get him to take this $10,000 bribe to discredit the incident. He pursued Mike with letter after letter after letter. He never once attempted to call me or write to me, ever. Now, isn't that kind of odd? And I'm not trying to be suggestive, because it does make sense to me. Even with his tactics of altering quotations and stuff, you would think that he would try to get me to say something that he could twist. The closest he ever came was to quote some other journalist saying Travis had said that he had been bleeding heavily, even though there was no trace of any blood on his clothing, blah, blah, blah. We went back to the tape. It's very clear. I said, I was breathing heavily. And he said, I'll give you $1,000 if you can disprove any one of these points. And that was one of them, so he never paid off on that one. But anyway, thank you for your kind remarks. There is a lot of ongoing research, follow-up research. I was describing the further EKGs, further studies on the plants, follow-up on a number of things, and trying to locate the original Apple files, which mysteriously disappeared, along with the sheriff's file. We went to the sheriff back when the movie was being made and said, you know, case is closed, can we get a copy of the file? We said, sure, come back tomorrow. And then they said, we looked for it, can't find it. The sheriff had some copies of that in his own home, and he made copies for us and was happy to provide them. So who got a hold of that? It might have been one of these federal criminal investigators that I think our UFO skeptic is sicked on Mike. Came to Mike and wrote up a bunch of stuff about his contracting, a basic confession, and tried to intimidate Mike into signing it. He says, that stuff's not true, I'm not signing that. And you know, the guy became enraged. He was a huge man, very intimidating, but he left. But we found out that he had gone to the sheriff and examined the investigation of the UFO file. So, and to this day, Mike says that this federal guy just keeps messing with him. Well, walk up to him when he's in the store and stuff. Harassment, where the government's, you know, actually taking money out of his account. This is really strange. He went to the bank and said, you know, small amounts are disappearing here and there at periodic intervals. What's going on here? They said, we're not allowed to tell you. And, he said, and she said, all right, I'll tell you, but I'm not supposed to tell you this. It was the IRS. So Mike went to them and said, what are you guys doing? And they immediately refunded every dime with interest. Now, isn't that strange?
Yeah.
You know, maybe it's just some kind of harassment. I mean, if they had any legal judgment or anything come down, that they would stand their ground. But why, you know, panic and giving the money back with interest? It was, you know, that's the opposite of the way the IRS works. But the harassment continues. But we have to push forward. And you know, you were asking me about, you know, why I'm still talking about it. You know, it gradually dawned on me that I can't escape it. You know, I have to accept the downside of it. I've tried going away and not talking about it. But gradually, you know, I come to realize there's a huge responsibility here too. I have an opportunity to make people realize a number of things. These things really do happen, that there is an organized effort to suppress it, and to sort of raise the bar about what we're going to offer to the public. Because, you know, some cases are cases of mistaken identity. You know, people see a weather balloon or a meteor or something and they report it, and, you know, the skeptics grab onto that, and the media is too easily swayed by saying, well, if we can disprove one report, then we, you know, so goes the rest of them. So I'm not saying people that can't provide as much documentation like I have. You know, I've gone in my book, you know, which is offered here, and taken on each and every charge that these skeptics and just totally blew them out of the water. Every theory that they had, I point them to documented, provable evidence that they can go to for themselves. And I think that's constructive to sort of set the bar about what cases we're going to call, you know, credible. I've spoken to military pilots, airline pilots, you know, professional people from every walk of life. You know, a lot of good, solid reports out there. Not all of them will stand up to the skeptics, because, you know, it's so easy. You can give the most lame excuse or explanation to discredit something. Oh, it's the planet Jupiter. And people will just grab onto that. Oh yeah, okay, you know, this can't happen. If that's what they want to believe. I come up with this saying that to those who have experienced it, no more proof is necessary. To those who don't want to believe, no amount of proof is sufficient. Thanks for listening. Okay. We still got the room. Go ahead. What's your question?